Hey everyone, I've had a really good request come in from Rastko Ristich, who wants to know how to make my own jazzy chord progressions. So what we're going to do today is look at how you can write your own progressions for improvisation practice or songwriting or production or whatever. I'm going to interpret Rastko's word jazzy pretty broadly and think about how we can build progressions that go beyond the plain vanilla chords, the straightforward C, A minor, F, G7 kind of thing, and learn how to incorporate some more interesting and richer sounding chords and changes. Along the way, I'm going to give you a few exercises you can use to develop your skills. If you enjoy this tutorial, don't forget to hit like, say hello in the comments, and subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting the red subscribe button in the lower right hand corner of the screen. Also check out my books. Right now I have a bundle deal running on the digital editions of my 3 current books. So that's How to Really Play the Piano, the Stuff Your Teacher Never Taught You, an Introduction to Cocktail Piano, and 7 Studies in Pop Piano. You can get all 3 for £18.95 as part of the bundle deal, which is a 30% saving on buying them separately. And if you've already got one of them, don't worry, because you can still get a discount on the other 2. Head over to billspianopages.com/bundle to find out more about that deal. Let's start with a quick crash course in some fundamental music theory concepts: scales, diatonic chords, tonics, dominants, and things like that. Now, if you're on top of that stuff already, then skip on forward to the next chapter. But if you're not, or if your knowledge is a bit rusty, then stick around. But don't worry if you don't absorb all of it right away. Now, any major key, C major, F major, G major, whatever, has its very own major scale. Here's the scale of C major, going up 1 octave. And here's the scale of F major. And the scale of D major. Major scales, like any scale, follow a particular pattern of notes, a pattern of intervals as they go up the piano keyboard. Now, I'm not going to go into how to build scales here, okay? It's quite a big subject. I don't want to get bogged down in it. What I'll say for today is, if you want to know the scale of any major key, just Google it for now, okay? Google will tell you the scale of any major key. Now, here's the important thing. From our scales, we can grow chords, and the way we do that is by using a simple chord shape called a root position triad. Here's a root position triad that has C as its root note, its lowest note. Now, if we take that chord shape and run it up the scale of C, so that the root, the lowest note of each chord, is a note of the scale, and the other 2 notes of the chord are built using only notes from the scale, then we get 7 chords. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And they all have names: C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, and B diminished, before the whole thing starts again, because we get back up to another C. And we can repeat the scale going up and up the piano. Let's do the same thing in the key of F major. So there's the scale of F major with that single black note, the B flat. Here's our root position triad starting on F. So we go F, G minor, because we've got that B flat in the scale. We can't play G major, it has to be G minor. A minor, B flat, C, D minor, and E diminished. All I'm doing is taking that simple root position triad and running it up the scale using the notes of the scale to build the chords. Let's go back into C major. Now, those chords that we can grow out of the major scale are what we call the diatonic chords of the key. And here's why diatonic chords are important. If you have a song in the key of C major, then most and perhaps all of the notes in that song will come from the C major scale. And most and perhaps all of the chords in that song will come from that list of 7 diatonic chords, or extensions of them, like sevenths. There's a G7 chord, which is a simple extension of a G chord. Also, within that C major song's chord progression, those diatonic chords will each do particular jobs, functions we call them, that give the progression its structure and keep it moving. One more thing we need to know before we start building some progressions, and this is really important. We can also give the diatonic chords of a key numbers, using uppercase Roman numerals for major chords and lowercase Roman numerals for minor and diminished chords. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we're back to 1 at the top of the scale. We can even give them names. We call the number 1 chord the tonic chord, the number 2 chord the supertonic, number 3 is the mediant, number 4 is the subdominant, number 5 is the dominant, number 6 is the submediant, and number 7 is the leading tone chord. Those names and numbers also apply to the underlying tones, okay, which we sometimes call the degrees of the scale. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1. Those names and numbers are really, really useful because they let us talk about harmonic principles across keys, okay? So we can say talk about the relationship between the dominant chord, the 5 chords, and the tonic chord, the 1 chord, whether we're in C major or F major or A major or whatever, because all of those different keys will have different chords as their tonics and dominants. Okay, that's the end of the crash course. Let's look at how we can build progressions out of those chords. Let's start out by thinking about how to build basic chord progressions, and then we can dig into some ways of making things more elaborate. Now, the first thing you need to know about chord progressions is that the clue is in the name. A progression always goes somewhere, it makes progress. You can think of a chord progression as being like a journey or a series of journeys. Now, that journey almost always ends on the tonic chord, which is the chord that feels like home. So if we're in the key of C major, in our progression we might go through all sorts of different chords, but we're likely to end on the tonic chord, the number 1 chord that feels like home. It feels like we're at rest. Now, most of the time, by no means always, but most of the time, your chord progression will also begin on the tonic chord. Between that first chord, whatever it is, and the final tonic chord, a progression will typically go out and back home to the tonic, out and back home to the tonic, maybe several times. It's kind of a process of tension and release. The further away we get from the tonic chord in terms of tonality, the way the chord sounds, and that's not necessarily the same as distance away in the scale or on the piano keyboard, then the more the tonic wants to drag us back. It's kind of like going for a walk from your front door but with a bungee cord tied to your back and anchored into the ground, yeah? The further you go, the harder you're being pulled back. Now, of our 7 diatonic chords, the most distant point we can usually get to from the tonic is the 5 chord, the dominant. That's G in the key of C major, and there I'm playing G in a different shape from the one we've seen. So we first saw it in that tonic triad shape, but here it is in a different shape, a different voicing. Remember, you can always do that with chords on the piano keyboard. Yeah? Now that G, if you listen to it, really wants to take us back to C, the tonic, especially if we add the 7th and make it G7, that's an F, a dominant 7th chord. Yeah? When that G7 drags us back to C, when it resolves, to use the technical term, we call that a type of cadence, which, to simplify things, is just a technical term for what happens when one chord takes us to another. This particular cadence is 5-1. Let's play it in a different voicing. Dominant to tonic. Yeah, an authentic cadence, to use the technical terminology. I don't want to get too deep into cadence terms here because they do get kind of messy, but it's worth knowing that they exist. Now, thinking back to what we said earlier about chords having different jobs or functions in a progression, we would say that the job of the tonic is to be the chord that sounds like home, and the job of the dominant, perhaps expressed as a dominant 7th, is to be the chord that really, really wants to take us back home. It's the furthest chord out. It really wants to take us back to the tonic. Dominant, tonic, 5-1. So many chord progressions will start on the tonic, then go out to the dominant chord, and then come back to the tonic chord. and then go for another little adventure out to the dominant and back to the tonic. 5, 1, dominant, tonic. Now, I was playing all of those chords in different voicings and inversions. Those are just for technical terms, meaning I was using different shapes, but they were all basically 5 and 1 chords in the key of C major, either G or G7 and C. Okay, 5 and 1, dominant, tonic in the key of C major. Now, a chord progression can be as simple as that. You could have a progression in C major that just went C, G, and so on. But most progressions have more to them than that. The dominant and tonic chords tend to be the most important ones. They're the kind of tent poles holding up the whole structure, but there might be other chords strung between them, especially on the journey between tonic and dominant. And that's where our other diatonic chords come in, because all of those diatonic chords in any major key have different functions. We know about the functions of the tonic and the dominant, but other chords have functions as well. So some of those other diatonic chords, their job is also to sound a little bit like the tonic, whereas some of them have a job that is to lead us naturally to a dominant chord. Let's have a look at a mini progression where you can see that in action. You might have seen someone sit at the piano somewhere, sometime, and do this. Billions of people can do this. It's really annoying, but it nicely demonstrates that kind of progression. We've got 4 chords: C, A minor, F, and G. We're in the key of C major. You can see where the tonic and dominant are. There's our tonic, and there's our dominant. But between the two, we go through a couple of other chords. We go from C to A minor, which sounds a little bit like the tonic, has a little bit of that home feeling. Not quite as much as C, but it still has that tonic feeling. Then we get to F, the number 4 chord, and that is one of those chords that naturally wants to lead us to the dominant chord. We could go back to the tonic chord from there, but it's a natural one to take us to the G, to the 5 chord. 1, 6, 4, 5, and back to 1. Yeah, so very often we have other diatonic chords on the journey out between 1 and 5. Sometimes, less often but still plenty often enough, you will also pass through other chords on the journey back from dominant to tonic, okay? It kind of tends to happen most often in blues and jazz and things like that. If you think about 12-bar blues, if we're in the key of C major, then towards the end of a 12-bar section we get to the dominant chord, but then we pass back through a 4 chord, a subdominant, to the C, rather than going straight from dominant to tonic. But that is less common. Now, this isn't a tutorial on chord function, and it would all get very technical very quickly if we started talking about all the different functions of all the different diatonic chords, and you don't really need to know them to get started writing your own progressions, so we're going to stay away from that particular rabbit hole today. But before we move on to thinking about how to make your progressions more jazzy, to use Rasko's term, I want to give you a couple of exercises you can do to help you firm up your grasp of the basics of how to build chord progressions. Yeah, so you can either pause the tutorial and do them now, or you can skip back to this bit of the video when we're done. I'll make sure that it's nice and clearly marked in the chapters. Okay, so I've got 2 exercises you can try. First of all, find a chord progression for a major key song that you like. You can either find it online, or even better, get it out of a songbook. It's much more likely to be accurate if you get it from a songbook. Now look at that progression and try to analyse it. Figure out how it works. How is it engineered in terms of the theory we've just talked about? So what key is it in? What are the tonic and dominant chords, and how does the song find its way from the tonic to the dominant and back again, if indeed it does. If you can, try to choose a song that starts with the tonic chord as well as ending with a tonic chord. It'll just make things a little bit easier. Also, don't try to analyse a whole song, because you'll get complications like middle eights and things like that. Just look at the first 8 bars, the first 8 measures, or something like that. Progressions, by the way, and this is useful to know when you're writing your own, tend to come in multiples of 4 bars, 4 measures, so 4, 8, 16. They don't have to, but over the years composers and songwriters have found that those lengths give the most balance and structure to their chord progressions. Second exercise, pick a major key like C and work out its diatonic chord, so you'll need to know the scale to do that. Then try to come up with your own basic progression using those chords. Now you can do that in one of 2 ways. Either you can kind of feel your way by ear, going from the tonic and experimenting with the sounds of your chords to try to get you to the dominant, okay, and that's maybe a good way to start out because using your ear is always good. Alternatively though, you can kind of paint by numbers. So if you draw a 2x4 grid, so you've got 8 bars, 8 measures, and write the tonic chord in the first and last bar and the dominant chord in the last but 1 bar, okay, then try filling in the rest. Again, fiddle around with the chords on the keyboard. You might put other dominant chords in there. Here's a tip, a good place for another dominant chord might be in bar 4. Or you might not put other dominant chords in there. Again, play around and listen to the different sounds you can create. Trust your ear to tell you what works and what doesn't. Let's move on and think about that word jazzy that Rastko used. How do we take our basic plain vanilla chord progressions and make them more interesting and exotic and elaborate and richer? Well, one of the easiest ways to add interest to a chord progression is to extend the chords. Okay, let me show you exactly what I mean by that if chord extension is not a concept you've come across before. If we go back to the little progression we were using a minute or 2 ago, C, A minor, F, G. We know it loops round and round and round. It's a really straightforward progression. I'm playing it in slightly different voicings there, but they're still the same chord. C, A minor, F, G. Now let's look at what happens if we just extend each one of those chords by adding particular types of seventh. We get C major 7, A minor 7, F major 7, G7. Straight away you can hear that things are beginning to sound richer and more interesting. But all the sevenths that we've added are diatonic to the key, which is C major. So if you look at the extra notes that we've added here, all of them come from the C major scale. So we're not doing anything tremendously adventurous, but we are enriching the sound with simple extensions. We can make extensions way more complicated than that, okay? So for example, let's push the boat out. Let's chuck a C major 13 chord in there. That's a C major 13. Playing it in a particular voicing to make it easy to play. Some of its notes are missing, but that is the basic chord. And it's very different from a basic C chord, but it will still function as a C chord within the progression. Now, chord extension is a huge subject, and I'm not going to be able to show you everything you can do with every chord in this one tutorial. But if it's something that's new to you, I can give you some pointers so you can dig around in my other tutorials or in other YouTube channels or books or whatever to find out more. Some chord extensions are really, really common. So for example, we've already seen G7, a dominant 7th chord, and all it is really is a simple extension of a basic G chord. So there's G and there is the 7th added. Okay, now that is a diatonic chord, a naturally occurring chord in the key of C major, because the F we're adding appears in the C major chord, the C major scale. The effect of the dominant 7th is interesting. What it does when it's on the 5 chord like that is intensify the dominant effect of the 5 chord. So there's the basic G chord in C major, and that's a reasonable pull back to the tonic. But if we add the 7th and make it a dominant 7 chord, it's a stronger pull back to the tonic. But if we were to create dominant 7th chords on other notes of the C major scale, very different things would start to happen. So we know that F, for example, is diatonic in the key of C major, but what if we play F7? suddenly we've got that kind of edgy, bluesy sound. Same thing happens if we take it to the tonic chord and we play a C7. So, and both of the notes we're adding there aren't diatonic to C. So E flat on the F7 doesn't appear in the C major scale, B flat doesn't appear in the C major scale. So there's an important lesson. We know that chords have different effects depending on the context, depending on the key they're in, but so do their extensions. So a G7 in the key of C major sounds very neat and tidy and very upright and proper, and all it's going to do is take us to C. But if we were to play that G7 in the key of G, then right away it would sound very bluesy and very, very different. So context is everything, and this is yet another reason why it's good to get to the piano, play around with these chords and listen to the effects that they have. Let's investigate extensions a little bit more, and we'll do that by moving into the key of G major. Here's the scale of G major. Okay, it's all the white notes between G and G, except the F is sharpened to give us an F sharp. And the diatonic chords of G major are G, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor, and F sharp diminished. Now let's take our tonic chord, our G chord. If we wanted to make that into a seventh chord, if we wanted to extend it diatonically within the key, we would add the F sharp. There is G major 7, just like the C major 7 we looked at a second ago when we were going through our little chord progression. As you can hear, it's a very different effect from the dominant 7th sound. It's not going to resolve us anywhere because we're in G major and this is the tonic chord, but all of a sudden the sound, the quality of the chord has changed. Major 7th extensions work really well on the tonic and subdominant chords of a key. So in G major, that would give us G major 7, and then the subdominant, the 4 chord, 1, 2, 3, 4, C major 7. The marvellous thing is you don't have to stop at 7ths. You can play major 9ths, major 11ths, major 13ths even if you want to. Okay, or you can do it on minor chords. So A minor is diatonic in G major, and we can have A minor 7, A minor 9, A minor 11, A minor 13. Yeah, you can start missing notes out if these chords are getting too chunky, like that C major 13 we looked at a minute ago. You could play that in G major as well, actually. It would be diatonic to G major. And I'm missing several of the notes of the chord of C major 13 out there, just to make it comfortable to play. I've still got enough of the notes in there to give me the character of that chord. There are simpler extensions. You can do things like create 6th chords. There's C6, it's just a C chord with an A added. Or an add 9 chord. There's C add 9 with the D in there. Look those chords up, try them out, see what they can do. Basically, as you're probably realising, if you want to make your progressions jazzier, to use Rasko's word, then there's a ton of stuff you can do just by using extensions. Once again, don't try to learn all the theory before you sit at the piano and play around with these things. That's the classic mistake of adult learners, okay? Instead, here's an exercise. Find a major key song with fairly simple chords and see if you can extend them. If you like, you can use the chord progression that you came up with for yourself in the exercise that we did earlier. Look up the chords if necessary. There are loads of chord lookup tools online, or I've got a video called All the Basic Piano Chords in One Epic Tutorial that will help you. And just play around with those extensions on your basic progression and listen to and learn the sounds. So we know we can make our chord progressions sound more interesting by playing around with the chords within them. Yeah, we've looked at some ways of extending those chords to get a richer sound. But what happens if we start to play around with the structures of the progressions themselves? This is where we get onto the territory of non-diatonic chords. In other words, building chords into our progressions that aren't diatonic, that aren't naturally occurring in the key we happen to be in. So if we're in the key of C major, we know that our diatonic chords are the ones we can grow out of the C major scale. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor and B diminished, and any diatonic extensions of those chords. But there's no reason why we can't drop in a chord like B flat. If we do, then we're using a non-diatonic chord. And if you are after jazzy sounding progressions or rich, interesting sounding progressions, non-diatonics are incredibly useful because they are kind of sit up and take notice chords. They are usually very striking. But you need to have your wits about you when it comes to handling them effectively. Now, to come up with non-diatonic chords for your progressions, you can just sort of play chords at random and choose what sounds good. And actually, I'd strongly recommend you do that at least sometimes, because as you know by now, just messing around and listening is always a good thing. But there are also conventional, tried and tested ways you can use non-diatonic chords in your progressions. And one of those that's really common in jazz is to use what we call secondary dominant chords. That's where we use a chord that's not diatonic to the key to act as a dominant that takes us to a chord that is in the key, but which isn't the tonic, because the tonic already has a dominant. If that sounds mad, let me show you an example. Let's say that we're writing an 8-bar chord progression in the key of C major, and we're around about halfway through and we're sat on the tonic chord, C. And what we want to do is get to a final dominant chord, G or G7, that will take us back to the tonic at the end of the progression. Now, if we wanted to be all kind of plain vanilla, we would do something like this: C, A minor, D minor 7, G7, and back to C. Okay, at the end there we've got one of those 2, 5, 1 progressions. Incredibly common, yeah? Now all of that is very diatonic and straightforward. If we were to introduce a secondary dominant, it would give things a little bit more zip. Okay, let me show you how we would do that. We're on our C chord, but then instead of going to A minor, we go to A7. Now A7 definitely isn't diatonic to C major because it's got that C sharp in it, and that's not in the C major scale. But it does act as a strong dominant to what comes next. The D minor chord, D minor 7 in this case. If you know a little bit about intervals, you'll know that A is a fifth above D. So if we were in the key of D minor, then A7 would be a strong dominant chord. Not the only dominant chord, because minor keys are a bit complicated, but let's leave that for now. So instead of our plain old C, A minor, D minor 7, G7, and back to the tonic, we've got C, A7, G7, C, kind of a jazzier sound. If we were actually playing jazz, of course, we would be extending all of those chords. C major 7, A9. That B gives us the A9 sound, to D minor 7, D minor 9, to G7. What I would probably do if I were playing jazz would be to use a tritone substitution there, a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial, but it would be that. Okay, that's a D flat 7 chord over G to take us back to the C, and now I'm playing a C add 9, again for a little bit of a richer sound. So that's the secondary dominant, where we're borrowing a dominant 7th chord that doesn't belong in the key of C to give us a stronger lead into a chord that does, D minor, yeah? If we wanted to go really crazy, we could use 2 non-diatonic chords and do this: C, A7, D7, which is strongly dominant to G7, and back to C. If you listen to a lot of traditional blues, you will hear that kind of progression. Yeah, there we're using D7 as a secondary dominant to take us to the G7, which means that the A7 is kind of a tertiary dominant, yeah? And this whole rundown, A7, D7, G7 to C, is part of the circle of fifths, if you've come across that concept before. You can have quite a lot of fun hunting around for other non-diatonic chords to add interest to your chord progressions. Again, it's a huge subject, but let me give you a couple of examples of things that you can do. I'm going to look at these in C major again. Now, it's important to say that you need to practice this stuff in other keys as well. Don't get trapped in C major. I'm just using it for clarity, okay? An important thing to remember there. Anyway, here's our C major scale and our basic unextended C major diatonic chords that grow out of that scale are C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, and B diminished. The function of that 7th chord, the B diminished by the way, is pretty much the same as the 5 chord, the G. It's pretty strongly dominant, but it's not as stable as G. You can think of it as being the top end of the G7 chord. Anyway, that's by the by. Now, one non-diatonic that I really like is to take the number 2 chord, the supertonic, which is usually minor in major keys, and make it into a major chord, say a dominant 7th. Okay, now we've already seen D7 used as a secondary dominant in the key of C, but we can do other things with it as well. The trick to using non-diatonic chords in a progression is finding a smooth way off them back to a diatonic chord of the key. Otherwise you wind up giving yourself a key change, which you might want, but you might not. And if you don't want it, it can take some undoing. Okay, so let's look at this one, C to D7. I call that jump the magic second. Yeah, that's just my pet name for it. It's not official or anything, but I quite like it. C to D7. Where could we go next? Well, what we could do if we're looking for a diatonic chord to go next is go to F. So that's from the tonic chord to a major dominant 7th version of the number 2 chord back to a diatonic 4 chord. Can you see why that works smoothly? It's basically because many of the notes of D7 and F are either very close to each other or identical. Okay, both chords share the A and the C, and this F sharp in D7 is just a semitone away from F. Now you could make that transition even smoother by using add 9 chords. Here's C add 9, which is C with a D dropped into it. Lovely warm sound. Note that I'm missing out that C there. That would sound muddy if I put that in. I've got one there and one there, but I'm missing out middle C, so we don't have too much of a clash with the D next to it. Okay, here's C add 9. And if I move to D7 and then to F, it's even smoother. Yeah, can you see why that is? It's because the C add 9 already has the D in it, so we've got a shared tone with the next chord, and it smooths out our progression even more. Okay, so shared notes and notes in close proximity are really important. C add 9 to D7 feels like a less dramatic jump than a straightforward C to D7. Play around with that in a few different keys and see what you can do. Another type of non-diatonic chord that gets a lot of airtime is the chromatic mediant. Now, if you believe half the stuff you read online, you would think that the chromatic mediant was some kind of ancient magic. Yeah, people are like, oh, wise one, induct us into the secrets of the ancient lore that is the chromatic mediant. But they're not mysterious at all. Chromatic mediants are actually pretty straightforward, and they are really handy as non-diatonic chords to drop into your progressions, but also as pivot chords if you want to modulate into a distant key. Different topic, I know, but it's a useful thing to know about. Movie composers in particular are really fond of chromatic mediants to help them modulate. But let's look at what these things actually are. Let's go back to our good old scale of C major, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. As we know, we can give those note numbers as well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1. And as degrees of the scale, they also have names: tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading tone, and back to the tonic. And the chords that we grow off of those tones, the diatonic chords, take those names as well: tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading tone chord, and back to the tonic. So obviously the ones we're interested in here are the mediant and the submediant. Some people say that chromatic mediants only grow off the mediant chord, but that is not the case. We'll come on to the arguments that circle around chromatic mediants shortly. Okay, so in my definition, a chromatic mediant chord is a mediant or a submediant, so that's E minor or A minor in the key of C, that has been messed about with in some way. And typically that will be one of two ways. Either it will have been made major when it should be minor. Whoops. So E major and A major are both chromatic mediant chords in the key of C major, or the other way it can get messed around with is by flattening it a semitone. So instead of E minor, we could have E flat major or E flat minor, and instead of A minor we could have A flat major or A flat minor. Now I don't think those flat minors are very effective, okay, although they might technically be chromatic mediant chords depending on how you define them. I don't think they're that useful. I think if you're in the key of C major, the useful chromatic mediants are E major, A major, E flat major, A flat major, okay. One of the great problems, and Wikipedia will back me up here because it does say this, I did check, one of the great problems with chromatic mediants is that there is not wide agreement among theorists about what they actually are. Okay, some people define them one way, some people define them another way. As far as I'm concerned, the useful chromatic mediants in major keys are the ones that I've just shown you. We've already seen one chromatic mediant chord at work in the key of C major when we used A7 as a secondary dominant to take us to that D minor 7 chord a few minutes ago. Okay, but A7 is a chromatic mediant, and there it was functioning as a secondary dominant. But chromatic mediants are useful as standalones in their own right, just like the D7 chord was a minute or two ago. So let's try a couple. Let's say we're in C major and we can go C. Whoa, you know, very radical sound, but it's quite easy to get back to a diatonic chord. We could go to the G to take us to the C, or there's that chromatic mediant again. We can go to the subdominant, the F, as well. Yeah, let's try it on a different one. Let's go. Now, the reason that those chords work pretty well as non-diatonics is, as was the case with that D7 chord, their proximity to diatonic chords that exist in the key. Okay, so if you look at the A flat chord in particular, we've got the tonic of our original key in there, C, and we're very close to the A natural. Okay, so that's why going from there to there sounds reasonably cool, and also we're super close, although there are no shared notes, to the dominant. Yeah, same kind of principle works for E flat. Now, as a very, very, very general rule, so general that I can immediately think of billions of exceptions to it, but as a very general rule, if you want that kind of ethereal, kind of way out sound, then the chromatic mediants to go for are the flattened ones. The A flat or the E flat. Try not to use them in succession, or if you do, be very careful because it starts to sound like a key change. Whereas if you're going for the major ones on the existing mediant and submediant notes, you know, that's when you get into the territory of winding up using secondary dominants and things like that. As usual, the rule is play around with them and see how you get on. There are no hard and fast rules. Just try dropping a chromatic mediant into one of your progressions and see what happens. Okay, I have 4 final tips to give you. Number 1, don't get obsessed with the rules. Remember that music theory isn't there to tell you what you can do, it's there to describe and explain what musicians do. Yeah, always trust your ears first. Number 2, make sure that you're playing around with this stuff in keys other than C major. I said this a few minutes ago, but it's really important. C is great for grasping the principles, but you don't want to become an expert in C major and a klutz in every other key, okay? Number 3, although the best way to learn this stuff is to play around with it for yourself, the second best way, and it's a close second, is to look at how other people do it. So to go back to Rastko's question, if you want to learn how to build jazzy chord progressions, you won't go far wrong if you get hold of a songbook of jazz standards or R&B or funk classics or whatever, and look at how those guys do it. You can learn an incredible amount in an hour sat at the piano with a battered old songbook. Number 4, remember you can also play around with timing. We've been looking at things mostly in 4/4 time. You can do it in 3/4, you can have 2 chords in a bar, you can have 3 chords in a bar, 4 chords in a bar, as many as you want. One very common way to add complexity and interest to a chord progression is to put in, for example, passing chords, which have been a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But again, if you dig around in other people's work, you will see them. Borrow them, drop them into your own progressions, experiment, see how they sound. Okay, so there we go. Rastco, I really hope that answered your question, even if it was in much more detail than you bargained for. If anyone else has any questions, give me a shout, because I'm always happy to respond to good ones. Some of the best tutorial ideas I get come from questions from you guys. Now, if you've enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, like, comment, do all of that stuff, and also check out my book bundle deal at billspianopages.com/bundle, or click the little YouTube card that you'll find in the top right hand corner of the screen. That's a really great deal that I've got running at the moment. Have fun playing around with your chord progressions, and I'll see you next time.